As Seventh-day Adventists, we traditionally believe that when Revelation 13:18 says, "Count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666," that this man represents the Pope, and the number of his name is Vicarius Filii Dei, or Vicar of the Son of God. Well, in this two-part series, you're going to see that this man is not the Pope, and his name is not Vicarius Filii Dei. I remember the first time that I learned of the phrase Vicarius Filii Dei. And when the preacher presented how he calculated the number 666 from the phrase Vicarius Filii Dei, I was thinking to myself, wow, that's amazing. I can also remember looking at websites that showed the Vicarius Filii Dei name or title being used back in the earlier centuries. And to me, this was the smoking gun. This was proof that Vicarius Filii Dei was, in fact, the title of the Pope. And it was, in fact, the name that John the Revelator was talking about in Revelation 13. Now, I want you to fast forward several years later. And there came a time that I was doing a presentation for my own church. And the presentation was going to be on the books of Daniel and Revelation. Now, in this presentation, or in this gathering that was going to occur, there were going to be people from the community. And obviously they were going to be non-Adventists. So in this presentation, I decided that I wanted to present the meaning of 666. I thought to myself, if I'm doing a presentation on Daniel and Revelation, how am I going to present Revelation without going into, 666? So I decided that I was going to present this to this non-Adventist audience, this number 666 and the meaning, this Vicarius Filii Dei meaning that I had learned several years earlier, thinking to myself that I'm going to wow the audience once they see the truth of this number 666. So I began writing my notes for this presentation, and I began writing about how the popes ruled in the Dark Ages and they wore a crown, or some people say a tiara, and there was a Roman phrase on this tiara, and it had the name Vicarius Filii Dei on it, meaning Vicar of the Son of God. And I began to write down how this wording, how this phrase would represent the number 666. But a problem began to develop as I was typing these notes. However I typed them out, something seemed wrong. As I'm writing my notes, I just couldn't finish the notes. In other words, every time I would write my notes, I would have to keep on deleting them, because every time I would write it, it just didn't seem right. Not only did it not seem right, it didn't seem believable. I acted as if I was sitting in the audience listening to myself, and I'm thinking to myself, I wouldn't believe myself if I was presenting this. How would somebody, a non-Adventist sitting in an audience, believe me? And as I sat there just contemplating Vicarius Filii Dei as the meaning of 666, I realized there's 6 reasons why Vicarius Filii Dei cannot be the meaning of 666 that John is referring to in Revelation 13. And I'm going to give you those 6 reasons right now. Reason number 1, just because an Adventist pioneer held a particular view doesn't mean that that view is true. To many of you, the mere suggestion that an Adventist pioneer can be wrong is almost blasphemous. I've even heard with my own ears Adventists say that we already were given all of prophecy. Why are we coming up with new views? The pioneers gave us everything that we need. Now, I don't want to insult anyone, but if you have this view of our pioneers, it is the incorrect view. You see, revisionist history would suggest that our pioneers spoke in one voice, that they agreed upon everything, that they laid out all of our prophetic truths on one table and everything lined up perfectly. Ladies and gentlemen, our pioneers disagreed on an array of things, from righteousness by faith to the daily sacrifice to the 10 horns to Daniel 11, the interpretation of Daniel 11. And that's just a few, ladies and gentlemen. They disagreed on an array of things. So to suggest that our pioneers all agreed and gave us in one voice everything that we need is just incorrect. And this is why I'm imploring you to stop just blindly following the pioneers just because they're Adventist pioneers. Now, I believe Stephen Haskell, A.T. Jones, E.J. Wagner, Joseph Bates, Uriah Smith, and James White, to name a few, all had great truths that contributed to the belief system of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But now the question remains, should we just simply take our pioneers at their word, or should we test their word against God's word? Ladies and gentlemen, I love our pioneers, and I love the rich history of this church. However, I love the truth even more. Reason number 2, Vicarius Filii Dei is not an official teaching of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, when I first learned about Vicarius Filii Dei, I just assumed that this teaching was established by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. However, it would be years later that I would learn that this view wasn't unique to Adventists, nor was it established by Adventists. In Leroy Froome's book, The Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, Volume 2, page 606, he says that the idea of correlating 666 to Vicarius Filii Dei originated in the 17th century by a Protestant Christian author named Andreas Hellwig. And from what I gather, it appears that our Adventist pioneers adopted Andreas Hellwig teaching and made it part of the Adventist tradition. Now, even though our church has taken other doctrines from other churches, here we need to be careful because Vicarius Filii Dei wasn't held by the majority of Protestants in the Dark Ages. It was more so held by Andreas Hellwig and maybe a few others at his time. But just the mere fact that this is not from another denomination and it wasn't widely believed in the Dark Ages, here we must tread lightly and we must examine this teaching thoroughly. Reason number 3, the popes no longer use the Vicarius Filii Dei title. Now, this may seem very basic to you, but at its core, Vicarius Filii Dei title is supposed to identify the beast system that is to rule the world at the end of time. But it seems strange, ladies and gentlemen, because now the system or that title that's supposed to identify the system is no longer being used. And so now, how are we identifying a system by the title when that title no longer exists? Now, let me give you an example. Let's just say that 666 referred to the phrase Roman Caesar. Okay. Now, this will cause us to ask the question, if 666 refers to the phrase Roman Caesar, does this encompass the kings and senators who ruled before the Caesarian line? And does it include the emperors who ruled after the Caesarians had died out or the Caesars had died out? Understand what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen. You see, when prophecy is hinged upon a title, it makes that prophecy fragile. Why? Because titles can change. Thus, the vicarious title wasn't used by all popes and is clearly not used by them now. And because the popes no longer use this title, this forces us to have to prove our doctrines from websites that have, archived this information or captured pictures of this information from way back in the early 17th and 16th centuries. Please understand, I'm not suggesting that the popes never had this title in the Middle Ages. What I'm telling you is that this title is still not proof enough that it represents the meaning of 666 that is given by John the Revelator in Revelation 13. Reason number 4, most of the world is unfamiliar with the phrase Vicarius Filii Dei. Ladies and gentlemen, if the message of Revelation 13 culminates at the end of the chapter by revealing to us that there is a specific name that or a title that this system goes by and it equals 666, don't you think that that title should be recognizable by most? I mean, think about it from this standpoint. If you were to walk down a busy street and you were just to ask random people, what does Vicarius Filii Dei mean to you? Most people aren't going to know what you're talking about. As a matter of fact, I'm going to suggest that probably the average Catholic is not going to know what you're talking about. And this caused me to wonder, why wouldn't God use a phrase or word that is a little bit more commonly associated with the papacy? For example, why couldn't God say the number was 256? That's the number of the Latin word Catholicus. Or why not 1016? This is the number for the Latin title Romanus Pontifex. God could have even used the Latin word Vaticanae, which is more commonly associated with the papacy. And this calculates to 106 as follows. What I'm saying to you is that there are a host of words and titles that are more commonly associated with the papal system than the title that was used by a handful of popes in the Dark Ages. Reason number 5, gematria should not be used to determine biblical truth. Now, you may not know this, but the way that Vicarius Filii Dei is derived from Revelation 13 is a process called gematria. Now, I want you to listen to the definition of gematria. From my Jewish learning, it says gematria is a numerological system by which Hebrew letters correspond to numbers. This system, developed by practitioners of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, is derived from Greek influence and became a tool for interpreting biblical texts. Ladies and gentlemen, the practice of converting numbers into letters and deriving truth from those letters is not a practice that originated with Jehovah. This is a practice that originated with pagan occults. Now, we have to decipher. Do we decipher biblical truth using satanic methods, or should we use God's methods to determine truth? Ladies and gentlemen, as Seventh-day Adventists, we should not involve ourselves in using pagan practices to decipher biblical truth. Now, please understand that using Roman numerals isn't inherently bad because we use them to decipher the Super Bowl every single year. But this is using numbers as numbers. But gematria is using numbers, converting them into letters, and taking those letters and deriving a form of knowledge from those letters. And this is a practice called gematria that is used to determine Vicarius Filii Dei, and we should not be using this method under any circumstances. Reason number 6, Ellen White never supported using Vicarius Filii Dei. Now, whenever I find a position in the Seventh-day Adventist Church that is overwhelmingly supported by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but was not even mentioned by Ellen White, that typically raises an antenna for me. I'm not saying it's false. I'm not saying that Ellen White has to give her stamp of approval on every single component that we believe in, but it does give me cause to pause because Ellen White spoke at length about the papacy and the Pope. She spoke at length about the mark of the beast. And you mean to tell me that out of all those times that Ellen White was talking about these components, that not one time did she ever mention Vicarius Filii Dei? Not only did she ever mention it, she never even suggested it. She never even inferred it. Ladies and gentlemen, after weighing the preponderance of evidence, I came to the conclusion that Vicarius Filii Dei, even though it's been a tradition of our church for decades, maybe since its inception, tradition doesn't equal truth. And ladies and gentlemen, we can't be so caught up on tradition that we simply overlook biblical truth that is literally right in front of our eyes. So it was at this point that I decided that someone out there had to have the meaning of 666. Someone knew this truth, and I was determined to find them. Out of 6 or 7 billion people on this planet, somebody, one person, had to know the meaning of 666. And so I sought on a journey to find out this meaning of 666. And here's what I found. Among evangelicals, it seemed that Nero Caesar was probably the most prominent of the individual that they believe when Revelation 13 talked about 666, it was referring to. However, even if gematria wasn't an issue, we have to be asking the question, why would John the Revelator be writing about Nero when Nero had died nearly 25 years earlier? You see, the book of Revelation was written around 95 AD, and Nero died somewhere around 68, 69 AD. So why would John the Revelator be warning them about Nero, who died several years earlier? Now, a growing sentiment among evangelicals, knowing that it doesn't make sense for Nero to be mentioned in Revelation 13 when Nero had died 20 years earlier, a growing sentiment among evangelicals is that Revelation was written actually around the year Nero died. So it was written around 68 AD. And this would give precedence that John the Revelator was clearly talking about Nero Caesar because Nero Caesar was the emperor that was ruling at that time. But here's what we need to understand. When verse 18 says the number of a man, That's the same number of his name in verse number 17. And that number of his name refers to the mark of the beast, which did not happen during the time of Nero. And this reveals to us that Revelation 13 is not referring to Emperor Nero, who ruled in the 60s. It's talking about a power that is ruling at the end of time. And so, to me, in my opinion, this rules out Nero as being that number of that man in Revelation 13. Now, I've heard some say that the number 666 is referring to King Nebuchadnezzar. And the reason why it's referring to King Nebuchadnezzar, because in Daniel chapter 3, when he set up the statue was 60 cubits high and it was 6 cubits wide. And then later on, a few verses later, he mentions 6 different instruments. And so some people look at this and they say, hey, 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, 6 instruments, hey, 666. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you have to know that this doesn't make sense. Remember, Revelation 13, it says that the number is 666, not 66 and 6. That number does not equal 666, nor if you add it up, does it equal 666. And furthermore, John the Revelator says it is the number of a man, not the number of a statue and his instruments. Then we come to the theory of mankind. And this suggests to us that because Adam and Eve were created on the 6th day, that's the number of mankind. Now, this is clever on, off the top is clever. But if we think about it, this cannot be correct. God says it is the number of a man, and the context seems to suggest that it is a particular man, not just a general assertion of mankind. And ladies and gentlemen, it seems anticlimactic to begin with that John the Revelator is talking about the beast and all these, horns and dragons and all these things. And at the end, it culminates into suggesting that all of this is because of mankind. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, the text in Genesis says that man was created on the 6th day. But Revelation says it is 666. So we'd have to account for the other 2 6s. Ladies and gentlemen, you should understand that even though these suggestions of 666 have merit and a lot of them have logic to them, these are not the meanings of 666. Now, at this time, you must understand that I had spent months trying to decipher the meaning of 666. And then finally, I got to the point where I said, okay, I've prayed, I've fasted, I've done everything I can. I don't see every road that I go down, it's a roadblock. And so it was at this point that I decided, you know what? I know Ellen White she never mentioned Vicarius Filii Dei. I know she doesn't support that idea. But is there anywhere in her writings that she mentions 666? And maybe in the way that she presents 666, it will help me gain an understanding of what this number really is talking about. So I searched online, I searched Ellen White's books, and I found one quote where Ellen White talks about 666. And I hope you're sitting down when you read this, because this may shock you what you're about to read. Notice what Ellen White says about the number 666. She says, I saw all that would not receive the mark of the beast and of his image in their foreheads or in their hands could not buy or sell. I saw that the number of the image beast was made up. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that when I first read this statement, I thought Ellen White was out of her mind. I thought she had completely lost it. You mean to tell me all this research that I've done for months and months, searching and researching, praying and studying, fasting, trying to find an understanding to 666, and you mean to tell me, Ellen White, that John made the number up? And it was at this point, ladies and gentlemen, that I fell into despair, almost a depression of sorts. And I struggled to pray. I struggled to study. I no longer wanted to study because I thought, Lord, you've sent me on this wild goose chase. I'm trying to present Bible truth to your people, yet you won't give it to me. And it was at my lowest point where I could do no more. And I remember going to bed one night, still upset, still angry with the Lord. And I remember that Sunday morning I woke up and I was awake, but I was still asleep. In other words, I was conscious, but I couldn't move. And it was at this moment that I could hear the phrase repeating in my mind,
666 is made up.
666 is a made up number.
666
is a made up number. And it got louder and louder and louder in my mind. Now, as this phrase kept repeating in my mind, it was at this moment, it was like as if God plugged in a supernatural USB cable into my mind, and he began to download information that I hadn't yet understood. In other words, it was information that I had read before, but it wasn't information that I understood. In other words, think of it like a puzzle. I had the pieces. I just needed somebody to rearrange them to give me a picture. And it was at that moment, it was on that Sunday morning, ladies and gentlemen, that God gave me a picture of 666. And when I woke up from this sleep, whatever you want to call it, it was then that I understood what God was trying to tell me. It was then that I understood the meaning of 666. It was then that I understood that Ellen White was correct. 666 is a made up number. And ladies and gentlemen, 666, when you see 666, you're going to understand that the meaning of 666 is not housed on any website. The meaning of 666 is not contained in anyone's title or name. The meaning of 666 is literally right there in Revelation, right in front of your eyes. You just don't see it. And on our second and final video on this series, I'm going to reveal to you what God revealed to me, and you're going to understand the meaning of 666 straight from the Word of God. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope to see you there. I'm the Adventist Watchman, and you should know by now, Vicarius Filii Dei is not the meaning of 666 in Revelation 13.